Welcome to Plantopia. I'm your host, David Goodori, and I'm a plant pathologist at Cornell University. Any listeners who have never met a real live plant pathologist can be forgiven. We are a very low visibility, but very high impact profession. We protect the world's food supply from disease-causing fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes, all of which want to eat your lunch. This time on Plantopia.
So, it's quite helpful to kind of carry over some of the understanding from this new virus pandemic threat that we face as humans to the threats that are posed to a crop like cassava. And it's also interesting that some of the control approaches that we advocate are, very much in line with the same kinds of approaches that are being advocated for management of COVID-19.
On this episode, what happens when you apply the most advanced technology in one of the least technologically developed areas? Think about this. There is a farmer walking around in a developing country, applying a convolutional neural network to make decisions.
This is a very powerful tool that I can see is going to have a very big impact in putting information into farmers' hands, helping them to diagnose the diseases and pests affecting their crops, and providing them with the information they need on how best to manage those pests and diseases. We think this is going to be a game changer for cassava in Africa. My name is James Legg. I've been working with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, which we refer to as IITA, for about 25 years now.
And you work on crops that may be quite unfamiliar to the average member, the general public, cassava.
Indeed. It's kind of strange thinking that there are people that find cassava an unusual crop because where I live in Africa, it's a hugely important crop. And in fact, it's very important right across the tropics. It comes from Latin America. It's brought to Africa in about the 16th century. It's a root crop, and it's a vegetatively propagated crop, so you can plant it from cuttings from an existing crop that you have. It's very adaptable, easy to grow in poor quality soils, does quite well under dry conditions, and is grown in Africa by hundreds of millions of farmers. In fact, in Africa, it's in terms of total production, it's the most produced crop in Africa. So that kind of gives you an idea of the importance of it.
Given that it's that important, what would happen to the diet of the area in which it's grown if cassava were not produced?
Clearly, since it's extremely important in this way, that if you have any constraints that impact on the amount of the crop that's produced, then that has a big effect on tens to hundreds of millions of people. I can add a few extra bits of information about the kind of crop it is. So it's a tuberous root crop. So it produces in the soil tuberous roots, which are a little bit like elongated sweet potatoes. And so you dig up the plant at harvest time, you peel and you boil, and you can consume it much like you would consume a potato. So you can eat it, we call it fresh, so boil it and eat it, or quite often it's processed. So it can be dried, chopped into chips and stored. It can be made into flour and used to make thick porridge. So it's hugely important as a basic starchy staple for hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa. So, as I said, anything that happens to its production has a big impact on people who are in many cases, relatively poor in sub-Saharan Africa.
What are the risks to cassava from insect pests and diseases?
So cassava in Africa is affected by quite a diverse range of different insect pests and diseases. Not quite so many as in Latin America, which is where the crop came from. Obviously, it's been there for thousands of years, so there are many insect pests and diseases that have kind of grown up, if you like, with the crop and damage it under certain circumstances. In Africa, we've got a smaller set of insect pests and diseases that affect it. We have a couple of major insects. So we have something that we call Cassava mealybug. Actually, this was introduced from Latin America, and it spread through the continent, causing very heavy losses. But fortunately, it was possible to overcome that through a biological control program. Another arthropod pest is the green mite. Again, this was introduced from Latin America in the 1970s. Unfortunately, probably through someone carrying it on infested cutting material. The other main problems that we face are virus diseases. And there are two in particular which cause particularly severe losses. One of them is called Cassava mosaic disease. It's caused by a group of viruses which are called Cassava mosaic begomoviruses. And another one is Cassava brown streak disease, and this is caused by two species of virus which we call Cassava brown streak ipomoviruses. Now, it's thought that both of these groups of viruses are from Africa. So when cassava was brought here in the 16th century, it found these viruses here, and they started spreading through the crop as it was popularized in the early part of the 20th century.
There's a long history now of growing cassava in this area, but in the recent years of that history, the population has exploded relative to the production of the crop. How then are we adapting to the need for food security, to stabilize production and to protect what available production there is?
Well, as you've rightly pointed out, as cassava has been recognized in Africa as a crop that can do well under very many circumstances and has spread and become more and more widely grown, the density of the crop has increased. And for pathogens such as viruses, clearly that makes it relatively easier for them to spread from plant to plant and from field to field. It's a little bit like the COVID-19 situation where, social distancing is promoted as a way of controlling spread of virus. It's a little bit the same thing with plants. The more you have closer together, the more spread of virus occurs. So as cassavas become much more widely grown, as the population in the African continent has increased, these pathogens have found it easier to spread, as I say, from plant to plant and from field to field. So this poses all of us who try to assure the productivity of cassava, it poses us a particular challenge. But fortunately, we've been able to make very good progress in responding to that challenge in several different ways.
It's a bit like the situation where I live in New York State. There are tens of thousands of cases of COVID-19 in New York City, but in the area where I live in New York, which is 300 miles to the west, people are outnumbered by dairy cows and white-tailed deer, and there are very few cases in the area of New York where I live.
No, it's actually a very good and a useful parallel to help people understand. Obviously, people who are living in, let's say, Western Europe or North America, they might find cassava an unfamiliar plant, and they might not be too familiar with plant virus diseases. But everyone now knows all about COVID-19, and they know all about the threat it poses in urban areas and densely populated areas. So it's quite helpful to kind of carry over some of the understanding from this new virus pandemic threat that we face as humans to the threats that are posed to a crop like cassava. And it's also interesting that some of the control approaches that we advocate are, very much in line with the same kinds of approaches that are being advocated for management of COVID-19, including quarantine and so on.
Is there any example of something like social distancing in cassava production?
I think there is a very nice example of an experiment that we carried out recently to try to control cassava brown streak disease. Maybe I can give you a little bit of background on this disease. So this is a virus disease that lives in cassava plants. It may occur in other plants as well, but mainly it's living in cassava plants, which cover the landscape as any crop does, as wheat does in North America or maize. Cassava covers the landscape in a country like where I live in Tanzania. Now, the virus lives in those plants, and it can be propagated from one generation to the next by a farmer using a stem from an infected plant. So if I'm a farmer and my field has infected plants and I use those stems that are infected to take cuttings and reestablish a new crop, which is what farmers would normally do, i.e. they would normally use cuttings from the previous crop to establish a new crop. If I use infected plants, the new crop will also be infected. So that's one way in which the disease is propagated. However, it can't move anywhere in that way. It's not going to increase. How it increases is also by being spread by an insect, which carries the virus from plant to plant. So if a plant is infected and I have next to it another plant that's not infected, but there's an insect, in this case, it's a whitefly, which feeds on the infected plant and moves to the uninfected one, it will then carry the virus from the infected plant to the uninfected one. Now, we've found through research that the insects that carry the virus cannot carry it for very long. So they might only hold on to it for a matter of minutes. So if they decide to leave, to fly, because they can fly significant distances, but if they decide to leave a crop and move in search of another, perhaps a younger, more tender crop, they're likely to lose the virus in a relatively short space of time, over a short distance. This means that if I plant a crop more than a certain distance from an infected field, there's a good chance that my crop will stay healthy. So we have used this principle to design a management strategy at community level, which is a little bit like a kind of social distancing. Let's imagine that in our community, we get rid of all the virus. I suppose in a human example, it would be a bit like making sure that everyone who's infected is sent off to a quarantine location or sent to hospital. So we only have healthy people in our situation. In our case, we did something even more drastic. We removed all of the cassava plants in a whole community. So we mandated all of the farmers in that area to remove their plants, but we had prepared a year in advance, so they were provided with alternative crops that could tide them over the period of difficulty whilst they didn't have cassava. Then we supplied those farmers with virus-free planting material of improved varieties. So all of a sudden, you now have a whole community who have planted virus-free planting material. And we were able to demonstrate the impact that approach had in terms of boosting the yields of the farmers in that community. Now, the yields the yield benefits we were able to deliver were roughly a doubling. So farmers got double the production that they had before. However, the process of getting to that point was extremely difficult. You can probably appreciate this is a huge kind of social exercise where you have to work with the community for a long period of time to explain everything, but it did work. And it's certainly something that we're still interested in trying to pursue on a larger scale, because if you remove infected plants from an area and then replace those with healthy plants, and you make sure that they're distanced from neighboring communities, so this is like the social distancing, they cannot become infected. Now, if you could replicate that at scale, you could remove the virus in theory. Now, obviously, in practice, these things are difficult. But much as it's difficult to control, through social distancing and quarantining, the spread of COVID-19 in New York City. Challenging issues, but certainly as we apply the principles, we can have significant impacts on the way that our viruses in plants spread. So even if you don't do it in a perfect way, we can still, even with our cassava, we can have a similar kind of effect to flattening the curve, which is what is being done with COVID-19.
Right. And we've done similar things with other diseases in human populations by different means through universal vaccination.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Plantopia is brought to you by the American Phytopathological Society, or APS, to honor the United Nations celebration of 2020 as the International Year of Plant Health. Healthy plants can help us solve world hunger, stabilize the world's climate, protect our forests, and add beauty to our lives. Now, back to the show. So cassava is in a system where it's under multiple threats. And it would seem that for the grower of cassava, that one of the most valuable services that we could provide would be assistance in identifying exactly what threat they are facing in a particular situation, so that they correctly identify the threat and then react appropriately to it.
Correct. This is a very important point. And again, there are parallels with the COVID-19 situation. We're told by the World Health Organization, test, test, test. We have similar parallels with our plant virus diseases. If you don't know the problem that you're facing, it's very difficult to mount a sensible, well-managed control program. One of the particular issues that we're facing, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is that farmers in rural areas have very little in the way of sources of information. Many of them will not have ready extension services or researchers from whom they can get information about the diseases and pests that affect their crops. Their internet connectivity will be imperfect. So it's not very straightforward for them to get advice on, which particular pest or disease might be affecting one of their crops. So this is where we've put a lot of effort recently into trying to develop solutions that can help farmers in remote locations access information about some of the major pests and diseases of cassava.
I was reading up a little bit on NURU, the convolutional neural network. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So we've been working together with Penn State University, the team of David Hughes, who runs Plant Village. And they have been working for some time to develop artificial intelligence-based approaches to recognizing critically important pests and diseases of crops that affect farmers in developing countries. So a few years ago, we started working with their team and focusing on our area of specialism, which is the cassava virus diseases. And we were able to record images of thousands of leaves showing symptoms of the main types of damage that affect cassava. So symptoms of cassava mosaic virus disease, symptoms of cassava brown streak virus disease, and symptoms of cassava green mite damage, as well as examples of healthy unaffected leaves. And they were able to then go through a process of training computers through machine learning to recognize the characteristic symptoms of each of these diseases. And this gave birth to the smartphone app called Nuru. So they teamed up also with a private company in India called Hidden Brains, who were able to put together the smartphone app. So it's now called Plant Village Nuru, and it's available on Google Play Store for free. You can download it. And one of the wonderful things about it is that it functions offline. So any farmer or extension officer who has access to a smartphone can download the app. Obviously, they'll need to be connected to download the app. But once they've done that, then they can go to their field and they can use it to get instant diagnoses of the major virus diseases and also pest damage of cassava. So this is obviously a game changer. It's putting like an extension officer in the hands of farmers, putting a hugely valuable source of information in their hands. So as well as giving a diagnosis of the type of damage that's affecting the cassava, it will also provide information in the particular local language, in the locality where the farmer's coming from. So there's information on how to manage the pest or disease. There are also sets of images of the diseases, which are standard images, so that the farmer can then also compare the diagnosis that he or she has received with standard images. And the farmer can also be connected to a network of other farmers. So they'll see neighbors who are also using the same system. They can interact with researchers and people managing the system, such as myself even. So, I could interact directly with farmers using it wherever. So this is a very powerful tool that I can see is going to have a very big impact in putting information into farmers' hands, helping them to diagnose the diseases and pests affecting their crops, and providing them with the information they need on how best to manage those pests and diseases.
This might actually restore the damaged reputation of smartphones.
Yes, indeed. Nuru is a very valuable tool for diagnosing the main pest and disease threats affecting cassava. However, you may say, well, if a farmer uses it and gets a diagnosis, what next? How do they use that information? One of the things that we're really excited about is linking this ICT tool with another that we're also developing through IITA, which we call Seed Tracker. So, for example, in a country like Tanzania, we have a network of more than 400 commercial cassava seed producers who produce high quality certified planting material of the latest, best, most disease resistant cassava varieties. And they're being registered on Seed Tracker. And anyone who accesses the Seed Tracker website can see exactly where they are because they're all on a map. Now, what we're working towards is to having a user of Nuru who identifies a disease in his field being instantly able to identify the location of his nearest high-quality seed producer, because the main solution to the cassava virus diseases is high-quality planting material free of disease of resistant varieties. So this helps us to link the diagnosis that's provided through Nuru with effective control that is coming from high-quality seed or planting material. The Nurus and Seed Tracker stories, I think we're super excited about them. We would like to be able to deliver them continent-wide. At the moment, we're only really effectively delivering them in 2 countries. That's Tanzania and Nigeria. But we think this is going to be a game changer for cassava in Africa. So, if we get the resources, that's what we'll be trying to do.
One of the things I do in my work is we use convolutional neural networks for high throughput phenotyping, for rating plants for their resistance to disease. And one of the things that is interesting about these neural networks is that they are adaptable. Once you have developed the technology for, say, a particular crop and a particular disease, we work a lot with powdery mildew on wine grapes. That system is relatively easy to adapt to new groups of plants and new groups of challenges to those plants. Can the same thing be done with Nuru?
Absolutely. And in fact, this is something that we are pushing for very strongly right now. I would like to say that David Hughes and the Plant Village team are really playing the lead role in this at the moment. And we're working with David and with something called the Roots, Tubers and Bananas program of the CGIAR. Now, IATA is one of the 15 international research centers of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, which is CGIAR. There are several programs within that, and one is the Roots, Tubers and Bananas program, which works on cassava, bananas, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and yams. And so the next step with Plant Village Nuru will be to broaden the coverage in exactly the way that you described of the approach of using these convolutional neural networks and machine learning to identify diseases not just of cassava, but potatoes, sweet potatoes, bananas, and yams. And in fact, we've already been fortunate enough to get some funding through the CGIAR's Big Data program to scale out the work of Plant Village Nuru, which will include an expansion of its application to other root, tuber, and banana crops. So again, this is another very exciting development that we're going to be working on in the years ahead.
For more information about the International Year of Plant Health, visit us at plantopiapodcast.org. Thanks for listening. Our show is produced by John Bryce. Thanks also to Mark Gleason, Jim Bradeen, Laura Isles, and Roshni Karati. I'm your host, David Godori, and you've been listening to Plantopia.